Hello.
Hi.
And your name is?
I'm Dawn Silva, bride of all things funky.
Woo! So let's start. I mean, where were you in your life when you met George? What were you doing? You had been singing already? How did that whole hookup happen?
Actually, I was singing with Sly Stone before we got with George.
Wait a minute, I knew that. So let's go before that then.
Okay.
What was your introduction? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Sacramento, California. Went to McClatchy High School and sang in a lot of churches and the madrigals. I did a lot of classical and choir, classical music, sang in church, the same traditional upbringing for most artists. And a friend of mine called one day and said Sly was looking for background singers for his new album he was doing.
Which album was that?
It was, I believe it was I Get High on You, or one of them, Heard You Miss Me. Heard You Miss Me, Now I'm Back, that album. So I went to, got in a car, we drove to Sausalito to a studio called The Record Plant. And I wasn't actually supposed to sing, I just went. They were doing a session. And they were working on a song at that time called Crossword Puzzle. And Sly's sister, her name was Vet, was hoarse, and so she couldn't sing the top notes. So I always sang first soprano and mezzo soprano all the way through high school and in church. So I'm sitting there watching, and my friend over here, his name is Michael Samuel, said, Dawn can sing those top notes. I looked at him like he was out of his mind, right? So it's like, so anyway, I heard this voice in the darkness say, so what you waiting for? I didn't know who the voice was, but I just heard this deep voice say, so what you waiting for? I said, me? He said, yeah, you. So I said, okay. So I walked up to the steps, because the record plant at that time was made like a gladiator arena with steps that went down. There was a board on the bottom. And at the time, I was like all of, 19, and this is the first time I'd ever been in the studio. So to this naive kid, I'm just thinking it looks like a flat Christmas tree, right? Blinking off and on, right? So I walk up the steps, my legs are all wobbly, and I got these 3 girls who were little sister glaring at me, right? Like, So I go to the mic, they put this song on, and so Sly's sister said, you know, have you ever sang in the studio before? I said, no. So she said, then she rolled her eyes, and then she looked over at the voice in the darkness, said, and can we get this started now? Anyway, I said, what's the part? So she sang the part down. She says, you got it, and I shook my head, and she said, do you talk? I said, I talk. So the next thing I know, the tape's rolling. I put the part down. It was crossword puzzle. That was the note. I said, that's it? She said, that's it. So I put the part down, and I guess it was a little too loud, so they stopped the tape, and my heart started beating because I thought I did something wrong, and so they all smiled at me and said, maybe you need to back up after all. So I did, and 15 minutes later, we were finished with that part, and I'm beaming, I'm glowing, I'm just like, it's all surreal to me, right? Wow, I just sang on a Sly and the Family Stone record. So I heard the voice say that, you sounded great, and then I realized that that voice in the darkness was Sly. So he walked over to me and said, welcome to Sly and the Family Stone. That's how I got in the group.
Wow. So you worked on, you recorded the rest of the album.
I recorded that album, Heard You Miss Me, and the second album was I Get High on You, that album. And then the next thing I know, we were going on tour with Aerosmith. And Sly at that time had all the cushy gigs. He didn't cream of the crop gigs. We were doing stuff like Don Kirshner's rock concert. We were doing the Midnight, what's that?
Midnight Special.
Midnight Special with Wolfman Jack. We did that, and we also did Tom Jones special. We did the Helen Reddy special. Every show that was really very big back in that day, the most black artists didn't play. Sly was on those. We even did the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville.
Wow.
With Minnie Pearl and Loretta Lynn. Those are the kind of gigs we were doing when we get a phone call saying that Parliament Funkadelic was going on tour. So they wanted Parliament Funkadelic, and Bootsy's Rubber Band and Sly and the Family Stone was going to be sandwiched in between. And it was a 6-month tour. So Sly said one day, he came to us and said, hey, we're going out with the Funks. I said, the what? He said, the Funks. I didn't even know what the Funk was, right? So that first tour was, I'll never forget, was Halloween, October 31st, 1976 in Houston, Texas. And when we walked in, I was like, wow, the funk people sure got a lot of weird-looking fans, and look at these groupies. Wow, they were people walking around with animal heads on their arms, and this one lady had on a skull bones all down her neck, and one chick was dressed up like a marijuana joint, and across her chest said, "Fire me up," right? So I was thinking like, man, dang, the funk show got some serious, fans. But then I thought, well, it's Halloween, so okay, it's Halloween. So we did the show, and it was probably one of the most extraordinary experiences I ever had, because we were basically, after we finished our show, George Clinton invited Sly, everybody to come on at the end, like at the end of the show. And I'm looking up and I'm standing on the mothership. It's like, oh my God, I'm under the spaceship, right? So it was incredible. We went out, we did that for about 3 weeks, and then Sly came to us one day and said he was leaving, the tour is over. And I said, no, Sly, we still got about 5.5 more months to go. He said, no, we don't. And he said the tour is over, so we were leaving. And I was totally just heartbroken. All of us were, because we didn't want to leave. It was so much fun. And then we left the tour, and George came up to us right before he left, and he said, I really love you guys' sound. You have like the perfect blend. And when the tour is over, would you ladies be interested in coming back and doing some session work with us? And we said, absolutely.
And then who is it? It's you and who else?
Myself. At the time, it was Sly's Girls. They used to call us Sly's Girls, because we went out, and Sly would go out and do a lot of pre-recorded shows. When he didn't take the band, he just took the girls. He took his girls. So it was Sly and the Girls. So it was Lynn Mabry, another lady named Virginia Ayers, and myself. And Sly called us the ladies with the perfect blend and the perfect look. And George, I guess, George had a knack for fleshing out thoroughbreds, I guess. He just knew when he could look at you, and then his mind starts, the whole funk referee thing, where he would see you and actually start forming in his mind a whole concept for you before you even just looking at you, speaking to you. So at the time, we didn't know that he had an ulterior motive for asking us to do these sessions. But we said, yeah, so one day he gives us a call, and we go to Hollywood Sounds recording, and the first album we worked on was The Horny Horns with Fred Wesley and Maceo Parker. That was our first project.
Let me ask you, since you have a unique perspective, you worked for Sly for a number of years, and I was with George for a long time. What is the similarities and differences between Sly and George? There is no difference between Sly and George. George just took it to elevated Sly's music, because he borrowed bits and pieces of everyone's. He did. I mean, you're talking Earth, Wind, and Fire. You're talking Sly Stone. You're talking James Brown. You're talking B.B. King. You're talking spiritual, even gospel, because it is basically P-Funk Parliament is very R&B, gospel. So he took all of these elements like a big, steamy, funky stew of music, and capitalized off of it. What he did is added the mothership and all these different characters, because he kept the equally freaky characters up front as well as the ones in the back. And George always says, and you can ask him when you see him, is that people will remember characters a lot faster than actually just basically individual. You'll remember the characters first. So he had Star Child and Sir Nose, and what he did is he created it visual as well as the music and the spiritual, because it's the type of music where you want to laugh and cry at the same time. You don't know why, but you're also enjoying the visual part of a black ball opera, so to speak. And that's what George did. That was different from Sly. Sly was straight R&B, gospel, funk, but he also had pop and rhythm and blues and a little classical music all sprinkled in. So the elements of the music were basically the same. The execution and the packaging was very different.
Yes, but George actually took it to another dimension by adding the rock guitars. He took the rock side with Eddie Hazel and Michael Hampton and, of course, Gary Scheider and Glenn Goins, and the list goes on and on and on.
At what point, so you do the Horny Horns album, and is George talked to you about doing your own album yet, or how does that all?
Not yet. The second project was Eddie Hazel, Games, Dames, and Guitar Things. And so we actually supposed to do one song on Eddie's album, and he came into the studio one day and said, y'all need to finish. And so we ended up doing the whole entire album, which took between the Horny Horns album and Eddie's, I think it took us about maybe a month.
Where you were doing? Is this in Detroit or L.A. or where you?
This is right here in Los Angeles. You know, we went to the studio here in L.A.
Well, you know where they worked? Where you worked on?
Ah, it's been so long ago. I know it was Hollywood Sound was one of them. I don't remember. It's talking long time ago.
So now you're getting sucked in to the whole.
We got sucked in on Halloween. I mean, we got sucked in on the first gig. We were clones, right? We didn't get our funk badge yet.
What's your funk badge?
Well, your funk badge is, you know, your official funk badge is not literally a badge. It's just like when you graduate. Because until you get your funk badge, when you're in the studio, if you're not singing it right, you get a phone call, and which is a polite way to say you're not singing right and you got to bounce, right? But a funk badge is when you get a chance to stay and do the sessions and sing with the heavyweights, and you're not getting that phone call no more. You're officially like, and when George comes up to you and say, you're ready to go on tour, that's when you get your funk badge.
Nice. When did you get your funk badge?
After we finished Eddie's album, we got our funk badge officially. So what George did, I basically believe the word started leaking that George was working with Sly's Girls. Because Sly's Girls had a little name kind of back in those days, right? So he was kind of leaking that he was putting a female group together. So some of the labels, and everybody was thrown in their hat. Arista, Warner Brothers, Polygram, I mean, all the labels that were out at the time. I mean, there's MCA. They were all Warners. All of them were coming in and basically looking to see what George was doing because he had that Midas touch at the time. Everything he touched went gold or platinum. So Atlantic Records, I believe, a representative came in. We were singing a song that was on Eddie's album, and we didn't know. We were just pretty oblivious to everything that was going on. We were just having fun and getting paid to have fun very well, may I might add. So when Eddie's album finished, George came to us and said, I'm putting a group together. I said, that's nice, George. He says, I'm calling it the Brides of Funkenstein. I said, the what? I said, the Brides of Funkenstein. He said, what do you think about that? I said, it's a little different. But in the meantime, we were still touring. We were singing background with P-Funk for about a year. In that whole process, all of that, George was basically, the wheels were spinning in his head, creative wheels, at that time.
Well, those tours, I mean, the Mothership tour and all that whole era were incredible shows. And I remember you guys were freaking out, funking out on the side of the stage. Yeah, it was so much going on, but I remember the girls particularly. You guys had little dances. How choreographed? I was always curious. How much rehearsal went on? Or you after the first couple of shows? Was they just go for yours?
We never actually had, there was never a choreographer that came in and put those steps together. We basically, he just threw you out there, and we just kind of made it up on the spot. And so that was the unique character that George had in terms of putting everybody in their own place, in terms of where it would work in his brain, and just throwing it out there and see what happens. And it just worked. We rehearsed every day. Vocals. Glenn Goins was the music director. And he rehearsed we had to rehearse every day. I mean, if we were doing 30 days, you best believe that 5 days out of that week we were having vocal rehearsals. After the show, before the show, after sound check, rehearsals, we were always rehearsing, always. Vocals were extremely tight.
One thing I remember is amazing about the P-Funk records is that they'll have a melody line, coming this way, and then there'll be another counter vocal line that'll start slow, and sometimes it'll take over and become the end of the song, the last 2-3 minutes, and sometimes the two things are going.
Yeah, the counter melodies that were overlapping, that's the signature of Parliament Funkadelic. It's just the waves of vocals, and we used to call them a wall of vocal sound. So it could be gospel, It could be classical. It could be opera. It could be blues, jazz, country. All those elements were going all through it. So it had, I'm getting myself chills thinking about it now. It's just that there was a type of music, the genre that fit everyone. That's why the whole One Nation Under a Groove was actually working worldwide, because it appealed to everyone from all ages and all genres.
I'm curious. I mean, obviously they had the melodies of the songs, but these things sound like the way they were arranged. Is that something you guys would be in a room and someone go, "What about trying this sound?" How did, because they were so intricate.
And then have us go put it down. But that's the uniquity of George Clinton's brain.
Yeah, they're just amazing. I don't think any other group has ever, that I can think of, has done the harmony and the different. You listen to the record, and there's someone singing up here, there's someone singing down here, there's a little bass. It's like a vocal group thing, but with the way the melodies weave in and out of each other, I've never heard anybody else do it quite like that.
Well, everyone was putting in their parts. We used to fight to get our parts down. And you got Junie Morrison, who from the Ohio Players, who was writing some very incredible vocal parts and the lyrics and the melodies. And then you had Glenn Goins, who was just had one of these extraordinary, one of the most powerful churchified vocals you ever want to hear. Then you had Gary Scheider, and they're all from the First Church of God in Christ, and so they're bringing in that whole Pentecostal sound, and everybody's like, well, what about this part? What about this? George's like, so that's basically what he did. He just, like, when I call it a big melting pot of a steamy, funky stew, that's what it was, with everybody and throwing in little ingredients and pieces and parts.
Bootsy talked about the fact that he liked to get early, and he would say there'd be people in there asleep. He'd walk over, because people would sleep in the studio and so on.
Oh, yeah. They
were incredible. There's incredible stuff going on there.
That, and the arrangement of Knee Deep, I believe that was, the production was basically Junie Morrison. That's another very unique individual, very unique musician.
Yeah.
Extraordinary.
I didn't realize he was, I knew the keyboard until we've been talking to people. I didn't realize how much of a vocal, people say they had a really excellent, great, fantastic voice.
Oh, he's a, one-man band. He's very extraordinary. Keyboards, bass, guitar. He sings, he writes. Incredible individual.
It seemed like also people seem to get along with, at least for, there's a whole period where you guys just from the 76 on to maybe early 80s, 5-6 years, just rolling. It seemed like it was a very good, the community, it sounded like a hippie community. I guess that's the vibe I'm getting.
It was a cult, it was an underground cult. It started off underground because before the females got into the group, George used to walk on a stage with nothing on but a sheet, right? He'd be nude under there, and he would just lift it up and say, hey, right, nothing. And then it was a hardcore, somewhat slightly degrading towards females, but it was a boys' club. It had nothing to do with women. And sometimes, like my mother, she was like, how could you sing at that group? Because of the artwork. The artwork was absolutely degrading towards women. You have all these women in all these orgasmic fits of pleasure, and with fluids flowing everywhere. It's trying to be nice. But we never actually, I never, internalized like it has anything to do with me. And I'm just singing the music and the parts and having fun, but the fans didn't think so. The fans thought we were a bunch of freaks. They did. They thought we were wild, loose women. We were not. We were just, it was a job. We were just doing a performance. But when the show was over, a lot of men would come to us with cocaine, a bag of cocaine, so we'd talk, come on, baby, let's go party. And then they would call us fake bitches because they said we wasn't the funk. Y'all ain't no funk. Because of the music, the way it was portrayed. So back to the boys' club concept, that wasn't something that I really liked that much in terms of the women. It did picture us in a light that I didn't particularly care for sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, Red Hot Mama on through, they had some raw stuff going on.
Totally raw, and you can just think about some of the lyrics,
Do I have to put handcuffs on your mama?
Handcuffs is mild, no head, no backstage pass. That's not just a title, Then you also had Octopussy and the Spanking of War Babies. I mean, there was just A lot of these songs, George was just writing whatever he felt. I believe he had, what the uniquity of P-Funk and George is that, and as well as the females, because a lot of the females, Malia Franklin, Shirley Hayden, Jeanette Washington, Debbie Wright, Lynn Mabry, there's 7 powerful women in that organization that were actually bringing the eye candy, not just eye candy, but they were also bringing the sweetening, and it gave that music the thrust and the velocity to take it to another dimension, because the females also helped flesh out the ideas for George as well. So some of the things that George would ask us to sing, we wouldn't do, like "Ick a Prick and Iron Pussy." I wasn't singing that. So, it's a nice song, but I didn't sing it. Like "Hard to Steal is Still Getting Harder." I'm not singing that. But I didn't have a problem with doing, some of the ones that weren't so totally degrading towards the females, and it was. But like I said, it was a boys' club.
I mean, you guys feel respected there? I mean, within the
within the organization, we were their sisters and brothers, and we were totally respected. They used to watch out for us. They used to watch out for us too much sometimes, I mean, they can go out and play whatever they want to play with, but, we couldn't bring any guys into, we couldn't have no boyfriends. But, no, they was a little, who's that? We couldn't bring them on the bus. But, they didn't have, but they could. But, yeah, they were very, very protective over the women. Very.
Did you spend a lot of time in Detroit during this time?
I did.
Tell me about, because I always wondered about, they're making all this creative music, and Detroit is probably at its lowest, one of its lowest ebbs during this period. Did that affect, how was it?
Well, see, coming from Sly Stone into P-Funk, we were wearing gowns and rhinestones and sparkly and long gloves, and everything was elegant. You didn't go anywhere with a safety pin attached to anything. You didn't have a hole anywhere. But with P-Funk was totally the opposite. So when we first got there, we were staying at the Balmar Hotel on Jefferson Boulevard, which happened to be a pimp prostitute hotel. And the police used to come and, raid the place a lot of times. And I remember here's a good story. One time we were going to the studio, right? And we called a cab. And we asked the cab picked us up at the Balmar Hotel. And we told him, take us to United Sounds. He said, y'all want to go to United Sound? I said, yeah, we want to go to United Sound. We got in, we closed the door, he took off. He took off, driving all fast. We going all like this. I'm looking at Lynn, and he's driving, and I was like, what's wrong with this fool? So anyway, he pulls off about 2 blocks from the studio, and he said, y'all get out. I said, we in the United States, and that area wasn't the greatest of areas, right? We in Detroit now, right? So he told me, get out. I said, get out. I said, why are you putting us out here, sir? Can you just drive down a couple of more blocks? He said, nah, they don't let no hoes in United Sound. He said, Smokey Robinson sang up in there. So they said, they ain't gonna let y'all in there. I said, we're not hoes, we're singers. Yeah, right, get out my cab. And then he drove up. He didn't even charge us, so it was snowing. We was in the snow. So we went on and walked into the studio. But that's the hotel we were staying at, because he picked us up at the Balmar Hotel in Jefferson. And that's I didn't understand, because there was money coming in hand over fist. I didn't understand why we were staying there. But after a while, you kind of just dealt with it,
Someone told me that when you guys went off tour, there was a box or some kind of crates, and they just threw the uniforms in, didn't wash them, and then...
You got that story?
Yeah. Is that true?
Yes.
So you literally, you get off tour, you throw your nasty, you sweat it, you've done 20 shows, they throw them in a thing.
I could give you a good example. When George was doing the Brides album, the first one, Funk or Walk, we walked in the studio, and it was just like this pungent, horrible smell, right? And I've said this story once before, so I'm going to say it to y'all too. Terrible smell. And so I'm looking at Lynn, and I was like, ooh, what's that smell? And George over talking about, George over talking about. I was like, I said, George, did you take a bath? He said, nah, I ain't taking a bath till the album's finished. So, and he didn't. And nobody else did either. If George wasn't going to take a bath, they wasn't going to take a bath either. And it was like, P.U. It was like, seriously funky. So, and then, I mean, seriously. And then not only just seriously funky, then he would go do a show and put on his stage clothes, you know. And then George used to have this long, flowing white wig, and he would sweat profusely. And he'd be slinging, sweat be going everywhere, just funk sweat, right? Everywhere, everywhere. So you see it coming, you need to duck, because if that sweat hits you, if that funky sweat hits across your clothes, you need to throw it away. You can't wear it no more. That's how funky that stuff, that's how funky it was. Totally funky.
Wow.
Well, you ask.
No, that's some fun. That's funk beyond.
Yeah, it's bad. It was bad, but then, do you ever get used to it? Not really. You know, you just kind of like, you know what you're, when you walk into the studio, you just kind of know that it's just going to
You mean all the musicians, no one would take a bath?
No, they wouldn't take, none of them took no baths. You know, every couple of them did. Ray Davis, you know, he's always wearing suits. And he was cool. You know? He was cool. Who else? Let me think. Gary Scheider, he was up there in the funk.
He had a diaper on.
Well, you know, yeah.
The diaper not being washed, not a good thing.
No, well, you know what? He used to change his diaper because he used to use the Holiday Inn towels. So he was pretty cool on the diapers. But the other stuff, you know, like armpits on fire and all of that, that wasn't pretty much the P-Funk.
Tell me about the first Brides album and how that all came together when you finally started recording.
Well, George kind of gave us a lot of creative input. He would come and bring tracks to us and say, "You like this?" And we say no. And then a lot of them were totally abstract, though. There was one song about a cat kissing a rat, and those type of songs we'd say no. I mean, we still had a little bit of the growing up because Lynn, you know, I grew up in debutante balls, and I grew up in, you know, being in beauty pageants, and my mother's a lawyer, and my mother used to give a lot of, you know, black tie affairs and shows and stuff, so everything was pretty much conservative. Lynn was one Miss Berkeley, California. So they used to call us the snooty and superficial girls from California, because we were coming from California to Detroit and hanging out with the Detroit girls. You know, everything was prim and proper and polished with us. So there were certain things that we would not do, you know, and like I said, the cat kissed the rat song, that was not happening. And then he had a couple of abstract songs, and I think George was humored by us by just trying to drop stuff on us to see what kind of reaction we would get, you know. But when he came to us with a track, actually Bootsy Collins had a song called Disco to Go. And when George played it for us, I thought it just reached out. One of those kind of tracks that just reach out and grab you from the onset. And it was so bad and so funky until I kept thinking that Bootsy was going to change his mind and take it back. So it was so bad. And it was his introduction. The song was how he used to come out on stage. Powerful track. And then we were listening to it, and then George started coming up with these nursery rhyme lyrics, which I wasn't too happy about, because I was like, George, this track is too powerful for you to be coming up with this little silly nonsense. Why are we singing about nursery rhymes like, Old MacDonald had a barn, E-I-E-I-O? I was like, and in that barn he had a dance floor? I was like, come on, George. He need charging chicks to pay the price of pork. Those are the kind of lyrics we were singing across this incredible track. And I almost started crying. I was like, no, you're messing it up. But he's, you know, and he started laughing at me. You go out there and sing that. So we did. And that song, phew, it took off, skyrocketed. Our first single out the gate, blew up. So when that happened, I just started absolutely, okay, George, okay. You kind of know what you're doing. So that was my first experience with George in the studio. And you always knew that it was going to be totally creative. You always knew that it's going to be totally eclectic, and you knew it was going to be abstract. But you also knew it's going to be a lot of fun, too.
He seemed to, it's remarkable because everyone sort of, how did he keep everyone together? I guess that's the question. Like, you had so many, Bootsy and Bernie and Maceo, and you guys, there's a lot of, and it's a big organization. What kept people together? What kept people moving?
Well, every entity had their own identity. That's the best way to describe it. Bernie Worrell on Arista Records, he had his own deal, was the Wizard of Woo, in the Wooniverse, you know? And his music was pretty abstract as well, but it was still funky. Bernie was classical trained, and so if he started playing Beethoven or Bach in the middle of a composition, nobody would even think about it, because that was Bernie. And then there was our sister group, Parlet.
And who was in that group?
In our sister group, Parlet, it was, the original members was Malia Franklin, Debbie Wright, and Jeanette Washington. So those girls were hardcore ladies from Detroit, about as raw could get. They were actually the female version of Funkadelic. In fact, in some instances, they were even harder than the guys. They were hard. There's some hard sisters. I mean, with vocabularies that cut like razor blades. So they took that music and they put it into songs like Pleasure Principle and songs like Wolf Tickets, songs like Cookie Jar. All these songs were pretty hard for females, but at that time, in that era, you're talking 1978, 79, they weren't radio friendly, so they weren't marketable, so they were kind of pushed to the back burners. Whereas in other groups like Jessica Cleaves, for example, who came from Earth, Wind, and Fire, and she sang with the Friends of Distinction, Going in Circles. So as she came in, she was more mellow and kind of laid back, so she was more R&B, strictly pop R&B for Jessica Cleaves. But Jessica had those mezzo sopranos, and she was like a mini Ripperton. So that's what she brought to the organization. And then you had Fuzzy and Grady and Calvin and the original Parliaments, who had that doo-wop sound on this side over here. And then you had Gary Scheider, Star Child, and Glenn Goins, who were the first church of Pentecostal. Then you had the Brides of Funkenstein, who were actually in the trades. They compared us to a cross between Rod Stewart and the Supremes, which we were. So we would kind of flip over to the rock side, but we could actually flip back to doing pop. And we merged that because George actually capitalized off of the fact that we came from a more laid back, more sophisticated edge. Then he put that into our music. So the radio stations at that time didn't have a problem with us because we were marketable. We were easy listening and radio friendly. So Atlantic Records got behind us and pushed us, and that's why we toured so much with George opening. We toured.
Yeah, Parlet didn't really get out there.
Again, Parlet was too hard for that time. They would be fine now because, as far as Lady Gaga, Yeah, Parlet was a pretty hardcore, very hardcore sisters, raunchy. And they were doing moshing before moshing they even had a name to it. Jeanette Washington would just fall back into the audience, right? Just fall back. And the audience would catch her. And we were in Europe, and they just took her all over. In fact, in Europe, they called the Brides of Funkenstein and Parlet were the, what do they call us? The funky, what did they call us? I wish I could, there was in the trades where it said that the Brides of Funkenstein and Parlet were the new funk extravaganza. And then there were article after article after article about these two female groups that went over there. In fact, what we did back...
You guys toured without the rest of the group?
Parlet and the Brides of Funkenstein actually did a whole tour in Europe. And then, which to this day, either one of the groups can go back to Europe to this day. Because they said that Europe was under a funky, feminine siege.
Well, talk to me a little bit about how many shows a year do you do now with the Brides? How many?
Well, I just put the Brides back together 2 years, not through any choice of mine, because you sometimes you just have to move on. Yeah. I actually released an album called All My Funky Friends on the internet, online, because a promoter told me funk was dead; it was no longer viable. I said, really? And he told me that I needed to retire and plant some flowers. So I had a new mission. So I put a new album. I put an album out. I put 12 singles. Most on that one album. Most people just put 2 or 3 singles and then the rest of it's cover. I wanted to make sure that I had 12 singles because I know that it wasn't going to get any airplay. And I went online and I sold it. Sold 65,000 CDs in about 6 months, from my kitchen to right to the consumer and back to me. Next thing I know, I've got a label called Music Soft in France called and said they want to do a license deal for France. And I said, cool. So they gave me the money, and then I went over and toured in France by myself. And then while I was over there, I was asking, where's the Brides of Funkenstein? Where's the Brides of Funkenstein? When are you going to get back with the Brides of Funkenstein? We love your new album. When's the Brides of Funkenstein coming? I said, okay, well, I'll give them a call. And then when Holland found out that I did a license deal with France, they did a license deal with me as well, separate. So I'll go over to Holland, and I'm opening up with Tower Power, and I'm playing clubs like Paradiso, the North Sea Jazz Festival. The North Sea Jazz Festival sold out in 2 hours at a Paul Akin Pavilion for myself. But after the show was over, great show, Dawn. Where's the Brides of Funkenstein? When's the Brides of Funkenstein coming? Where's Parlet? When you girls getting back together? So I said, well, maybe when I get back to the States. And so then I do a license deal with Canada, and I work all over Canada. Then I do a license deal with Japan. So next thing I know, that album is going crazy, but because I'm my own company and because of the internet, I lost control over it because everybody was downloading and selling it everywhere you look. So then I said, maybe I need to put the Brides of Funkenstein back together and do some new material. And then when I put the Brides of Funkenstein back together...
You and Lynn?
No, Lynn is actually managing Sheila Escovedo, and Lynn's in the management division. You know, that's what she does exclusively with Sheila E. So, you know, I asked her, did she want to come? And it's like, she doesn't want to tour anymore. So I went to go get my arch enemy from P-Funk, which was Jeanette Washington, because I forgot to tell you the story that when I first got in the group, they were a little intimidated by these superficial girls, and so she busted me in my mouth with the microphone right on stage. I mean, drew blood, right? So I was like, and then the next night it was elbowing and getting punched, and you don't sing on that part. So right in the middle of the stage, so it got to be a point where the audience started to say was kind of edging us on because the audience was 90% men. So they was kind of getting off on it. So I went over and told George, I said, this bitch hit me in my mouth one more time, I'm throwing her little ass right into the middle of the stage, right? Right to center stage, out in the audience. I'm going to throw her out there. So she got fined, and she never hit me in the mouth again, but we were kind of like enemies for a long time, but now we're the best of friends. In fact, Jeanette is now officially one of the Brides of Funkenstein to this day. So I went and called her up and said, Jeanette, you want to, you know, in fact, she went to London with me to Holland. She actually co-produced some songs with me on the album. So I called her and asked her, did she want to go on the road? You want to be a bride? And she said, yeah. So now she's touring with me as well. So it's Jeanette Washington of Parlet and Dawn SILVA of the Brides of Funkenstein. And we formed the new Brides of Funkenstein. We're working all over the place.
Who comes to your shows?
Everybody comes to the show, a little bit of everyone. There's a...
Do you find, is it just old Parliament fans, or you find 25? Tell me about...
Because we're an underground cult following, we've gone back underground. It all depends on where the venue is and who's producing or who's promoting the show. If it's a rock show, like we played the Whiskey A Go-Go a couple of months ago, sold out. It was all rockers from the ages of 22 to 25, total rockers. So that's one of our markets, and that's the more of the eclectic rock market. Then we have the Bagger-Saggers market. And so, I mean, which is more hip-hop, and they're around 30, 40 crowd. Now, like, again, it all depends on the venue. Then we have the old school brothers that are between 40 and 60, okay? And they still wearing, you know, they got little stomachs now, but they still wearing the same thing they wore back in the day and still. And it's 90% black men, like we played the Long Beach Funk Festival, right? We're playing it again this year. And it was a sea of black, you know, black men. It's the first time I've seen it in years. I haven't seen it since it was P-Funk. That's one of our markets. Now, we also do some shows with the Family Stone. When it's the Family Stones and the Brides of Funkenstein, you're going to get everybody from 5 years old to 85 years old. Wheelchairs to little kids and everyone in between, all races, all colors. And then we also do the Brides of Funkenstein and the Latin Kings. So we have the Latin following with the Brides of Funkenstein sells out. So we're one of those groups that are blessed that can play eclectic, rock, Latin, R&B, funk.
When's the last time that you actually performed with Parliament Funkadelic?
A couple of months ago, they came to Sacramento, and it's just tradition. Whenever P-Funk hits your town, there's really no excuse, since everybody's all scattered. Now, you have to show up, or there's going to be a problem. So George called and said, I'm going to be at the Cache Creek in Sacramento. And I said, all right, George, you coming? I said, I don't know, George. Yeah, you coming. I'll see you there. I said, okay, George. Click. And there I was. And that was 2 months ago. That's the last time I did a show with them, a couple months ago.
Does it feel strange to get back on or you just fit right back in?
As soon as you walk in the venue, you just feel like, it's the same way, because once a Funkadelic, always a Funkadelic.
We talked a bit. What's your favorite memory of that period? Was it doing your own album, or was it the shows? What comes back to you about? Because it was an incredible period of music.
I think the most unique situation for me that I always remember like it's yesterday was when we're doing Aqua Boogie. Remember that song, Aqua Boogie? And how George set it all up and got on a plane, went to Miami. Get up, where you going? We going fishing. I said, we going fishing? Thought we was going in the studio. He said, we going fishing. I said, oh. So we get on a boat, nice little 50-footer, and we sail out to the middle of the Bermuda Triangle, right? And George looked over at me and said, you know y'all at? I was like, no. He said, you're in the Bermuda Triangle. I said, well, we going out here. We going out here writing. We're going to write. So we had gone in the studio, and they had already had the track for Aqua Boogie, right? But the lyrics and the melodies were created right there on that boat, just from the whole environment of fishing out in the middle of nowhere. It was so quiet you can hear the insects. So I just remember the music was blasting, just the Aqua Boogie track was playing, and it was a little baby sparrow that was flying in for Bermuda. And he was so tired. And that little baby sparrow flew in and landed right on top of the tape recorder and went to sleep. And that baby sparrow slept all the way until we got back to Miami. And then when the boat docked, the bird took off. So that's when George wrote a song called Birdie for the Brides of Funkenstein. Tweet, 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 tweet. He cooperated, the whole trip, just from going out to the Bermuda Triangle to go fishing. And that little bird, the little sparrow that flew, and then the bird didn't fly nowhere else, and he landed on top of the tape recorder while Aqua Boogie was blasting and went to sleep. And George said, man, that's a funky little bird. All right. And then we went in the studio, and he wrote a song about it.
It's funny, Bootsy talked about being on the boat, too.
George used to take everybody fishing, because he loved, George was a sportsman. There's so many stories about George that are so funny. You could write a story about George's little escapades. And I remember when he told me he went hunting and he was up in a tree shooting boars or somewhere. And he went up to the tree and he fired the gun and he fell down and hit every branch all the way down. And I think what saved him was I think his life vest or something caught on the branch and kept him from hitting the ground. So George had a lot of stories.
Did he have a farm or a ranch outside of Detroit?
That's where he used to go doing most of his hunting, yes.
So people would think, they see that, they would never think of it as a fisherman and a hunter.
You wouldn't really know that he was a fisherman or a hunter until you went into his home, and you'd see his wall was lined with all these animals looking at you, all sad, and, then you know he was a hunter,
After, when did you finally leave, and what made you finally leave the whole P-Funk thing?
Well, I think it kind of just imploded, It kind of like under too much weight. I think it just, too many people at one time. There was absolutely no way that George could maintain. Okay, let me stop telling that fib. So good. I I think it's just the era of music, you know, it started changing, you know, everything changes. You know, disco came in and started, which, you know, the whole Donna Summers and the whole just generic, repetitive music just came in, and I think funk music had started easing out of mainstream. So yeah, I think that's kind of what happened for all of us. It's just that the things started changing. We weren't staying in the Hilton anymore. We weren't playing Madison Square Gardens. We were playing a lot smaller venues. The money started being less. Drugs started being more. People started being unhappy. And in terms of a family, sibling, and there's always going to be some sibling rivalry in families. And so at that time, as the height of the group started to decrease, I believe that everything started to change. Everything stopped being fun. That's when I had to leave.
You know, it's interesting because soul music, there's a million books and documentaries. Hip hop, there's a million books and documentaries. Even disco. I only know about one book on funk, and not that much visual, like, you know, documentaries like this on it. It's like funk is the forgotten stepchild.
Yeah, well, you know, that's exactly, it is the forgotten stepchild. In fact, it's like, funk is like the bad word of, you know, it is. It's just, I believe because you can't emulate it and you can't control it because it's so powerful, sometimes you just need to,
Let's go. Keep.
Sometimes I think you need, what am I trying to say without saying it? The music industry, I think, because they couldn't control the music, it's just like today, for example, if you put a funk song on the radio right now, it will expose what's missing in all the music today. So, because it was so powerful, they couldn't control it. So when you can't control something, what do you try to do? You try to shut it down. And they've been trying to shut down funk music for a long time, and in fact, they shut it down before it went from mainstream back underground again. That's where it is. But and anything that's spiritual or gospel or anything that you cannot control or emulate or assimilate, if you cannot do it, then they're going to try to shut it down. And that's what the industry did, basically, I feel. Personally, I think.
Yeah, I think we should, the party's about to, I think our timing was perfect.
Okay.
Thank
I
you.
I hope you understand. I mean, I'm trying,
there's so many, fantastic.
There's so many things, you know.
You got to, I know you have, but what you said was amazing and funny as hell.
Yeah.
You crazy? The boats thing?
It's really interesting.
What, the little bird?
That's a great, no, there's so many great stories. About the funk in the studio? That's
Yeah,
going in for sure.
I know, but the part, I didn't answer your question about why isn't there a whole lot of, actually, we're doing a book. It's finished, actually.
Oh, really? Mm-hmm. You doing it with Lynn or with Jeanette? Or?
Actually, I'm doing it with just me and Jeanette. We both, from our perspective and our experiences with the organization, starting from Sly. So, and actually, then I brought all the pictures.
Oh, let me see.
Because I have I told you at least 1,000 of them.
No, we take a look. No, we just because the sound's going to get bad doesn't mean I can't look at the pictures.
Why did it stop? I didn't like my answer on that. Why did it stop? That's okay. We're good.
What time is it now?
It's 1:08. 1:08.
I was supposed to start the party. I heard maybe they
Blasted for a second.